All right, good morning, beautiful students, and welcome back to The Tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. This is going to be a review of Act 2, and I introduced it to you before you did your active reading over the week. And now I just want to go through and kind of highlight a couple things for you that you should be aware of. All right, so Act 2 is the only other act that actually has a sonnet prologue. And this prologue is a little different than the one that we saw in Act 1. This sonnet really just recaps what happens and introduces what's going to happen from here on out. And like a true sonnet, right, we always want to look at that last quatrain and definitely the last couplet to see what the main point is. And what Shakespeare is saying here through his chorus is that passion lends them power. Time means to meet, tempering extremities with extreme sweet. And notice again, right, repetition here with the extremities. Passion lends them power, so they're emboldened by their passion for one another. And notice Shakespeare's commentary here on the love between these two. Is it love? Or is it lust? Time means, which means that time allows them to actually meet or basically create a plan. And because they do that, they can temper extremities with extreme sweet. Here gives you a nice little footnote, moderating great difficulties with extreme delights. So Shakespeare really says it's passion, time, working together. So when there's a question of fate versus your choices, it's really proposed to you in that last couplet of the prologue. And then we're into scene 1, and notice we're in a lane. So basically like an alley or a walkway by the wall of the Capulets' orchard. Now you have to realize that the Capulets live on a very grand estate. And if you were to see an older estate in Italy, all of them are surrounded by walls. And especially during this time in the late 1400s, when the actual play takes place, having walls to guard your estate, especially your wealth, is definitely a must. And so Romeo climbs the wall and hides outside in the orchard of the Capulet family. Now, just doing this puts his life at risk. But like they told us in the chorus, right, that passion is lending him power. So Romeo basically ditched his friends after the party and is at the wall of Juliet's estate when his friends basically come around the corner. And they're trying to get him to come out, right? His cousin Benvolio and his best friend Mercutio. And it's kind of hilarious, a little bit of humor here, a lot of allusions, right? Young Adam Cupid, a historical reference here, but Mercutio still thinks, and so does Benvolio, that Romeo is in love with Rosaline. They have no idea about Juliet. And so here we have a good example of dramatic irony. We know that Romeo is love-struck by Juliet at this point, but his friends do not. And you'll notice by what Romeo says in response to Mercutio and Benvolio's conjuring here. Let me see if I can find the line. Good. Can I go forward when my heart is here? Turn back, dull earth, and find thy center out. Basically, he doesn't want to leave, even though his friends don't want to leave a man behind at the party. And now when scene 2 opens, right, we're inside the orchard, all right? And Romeo, by himself, comments on what Mercutio says. He says he jests at scars that never felt a wound. And so here we learn by indirect characterization that Mercutio has never been in love. And maybe you guys can kind of connect to this at this point. You know, maybe someone in your friend group has already had a relationship, and you've had another friend who doesn't really understand it because they've never been in it themselves. And Mercutio, being the what's the word I'm looking, the comedic character in this piece, you know, acts out and taunts his friend because of it. So it's pretty interesting that he uses this one line to really give you a good picture into Mercutio's personality. Now, Romeo is all by himself, and when he's speaking here, this is known as a soliloquy. And a soliloquy is a monologue, but it's delivered only to the audience. And this really helps to build dramatic irony because we as the audience know exactly what Romeo is feeling here. And no one else, not even Juliet, knows the thoughts that he's having at this point. Now, he didn't expect Juliet, right, to show up, but she actually does. And so he goes into this beautiful soliloquy full of poetic elements to describe Juliet, right? The word soft to start off with is one of those Elizabethan words that means wait. Okay, he's like, but wait. What light through yonder window breaks? And he notices it's Juliet. And when he says it is the east and Juliet is the sun, we've got a nice metaphor here that uses light versus dark imagery. And he's really playing with the element of light to really show how beautiful she is. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief, that thou, her maid, art far more fair than she. And so when he goes off on these lines right here, he's actually referencing the goddess Diana, who's the goddess of chastity, which is a little bit of ironic allusion there, saying that the sun, or Juliet, her maid, is far more fair than she, all right? So basically, allow Juliet to bless the earth with her beautiful sunshine. Be not her maid, since she is envious. Her vestal livery is but sick and green, and none but fools do wear it. Cast it off, right? So basically, continuing with the point that Juliet is more beautiful and people are jealous, or at least goddesses are jealous. It is my lady, oh, it is my love. And so here, when he calls her my lady, my love, notice the repetition of my. Okay, we'll come back to that later. Oh, that she knew she were. She speaks, yet she says nothing. What of that? Her eye discourses. I will answer it. So he was thinking about outing himself right here, but he doesn't. Oh, I am too bold. 'Tis not to me she speaks, two of the fairest stars in all of the heaven, having some business, do entreat her eyes to twinkle in their spheres till they return. So he's looking into her eyes, and she's not looking anywhere down at the ground. She's looking up, right? She's twinkling like the stars. If her eyes were there, they in her head, the brightness of her cheek would shame those stars, as daylight doth a lamp. Her eyes in heaven would through the airy region seem so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night. See how she leans on her cheek upon her hand. Oh, that I wear a glove upon that hand, that I might touch that cheek. Right? And so he's falling more in love with her as he stares at her, basically stalking her. But again, look at the references here. Now, ladies, I don't know what your father would do if some gentleman was outside your window at night staring at you and he caught them, but you can kind of get an idea of what would happen to Romeo if for any reason he was caught on her property. So again, keep that in mind. Now, Juliet starts to speak. Right? This is a drama, so if this was something that was playing out on television, maybe it would come in this a silent soliloquy in the sense where the camera is just looking or focusing on the character, but the character is not necessarily moving their lips, but they are thinking, and the thinking will overplay just the visual of the character. But when you're on a stage, you actually have to speak. Again, he calls her a bright angel. Oh, how glorious to this night being over my head as is, right? Notice the simile here. A winged messenger of heaven unto the white upturned wondering eyes of mortals that fall back to gaze on him when he bestrides the lazy pacing clouds and sails upon the bosom of the air. Okay. He's basically comparing her in a well, we wouldn't call it an epic simile, but an extended simile to an angel in heaven. Now, she's also speaking in soliloquy, but doesn't realize that Romeo is listening. So, and of course, the audience hears it. And I think I went through this with one of your assignments already, so you can, look at your notes that you did for that soliloquy. Now, this is one of the most famous scenes in the Shakespearean play. It's often depicted in art. It's been stolen by so many different, satirical cartoon shows. And even, sitcoms will employ this balcony scene. You have to envision Juliet basically out on a balcony from her room, staring off into the night, speaking her deepest thoughts like she's writing in a diary. And little does she know, the object of that diary entry is listening to what she says. Okay? But Romeo speaks to what she says, and here we've got a lot of commentary on the name and what a name actually means and the tie to family. One of the motifs that will pop up quite often is this idea of the written word. And you may have heard the comment that say it, forget it, write it, regret it. And here, when they go back and forth about the name Montague, you get an idea of how Shakespeare incorporates this motif into his play. With love's light wings did I overperch these walls, right? So he was given power by Cupid. Stony limits cannot hold love out, and what love can do that dares love attempt. Therefore, thy kinsmen are no let to me. So here he comments on that final couplet of the prologue where he talks about how the passion and what he considers love has given him the power to come and speak to her. Now they pledge themselves to one another throughout this balcony scene, and in these monologues or long speeches, you get to learn a lot about the character themselves, right? And in this monologue, it's pretty important to pay attention to the indirect characterization of Juliet. By speaking her thoughts and her ideas, we understand her maturity, right? She says, trust me, gentlemen, I'll prove more true than those that have more cunning to be strange. Right? Over here, they kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what's being said here. But she's really showing how loyal she is, right? She says, I should have been more strange, I must confess, but that thou overheardest ere I was ware my true love's passion. So she's saying here, her loyalty is definitely true, but in the social times, right, she was supposed to play a little bit harder to get, right? She should have dated before she confessed what she truly felt about Romeo. But he overheard her, right? So that's all about this idea that the time is giving them means to meet. And when this happens, is it good or is it bad? She says here, this yielding to light love, which the dark night hath so discovered, right? Romeo says, oh, I swear, that I do love you. It's not something that I'm just lightly throwing around. And she when he says that I swear by the blessed moon, she's like, no way, right? It's inconstant, right? It changes monthly with its phases, right? Unless your love prove likewise variable, right? So she tells him, no, don't swear you love me by something that's not constant. And he's like, well, what should I swear by? And she's like, don't swear at all. But if you were to swear, right, swear by thy gracious self, which is the God of my idolatry. So here, a very strong line that really kind of conflicts with the Catholic tradition, right? We don't believe in idols. And the fact that she says that really shows how deeply enthralled she is with him. Here she says, don't swear, right? She doesn't want to hear any more words, right? She's really, she doesn't have any joy in this swearing of love, right? She realizes it's too rash, too unadvised, too sudden. And notice, through that repetition, right, we get an idea of her hesitation and her ability to think about situations, too like the lightning. And here, in this simile or this comparison, you'll notice that she talks about the quickness of love and how passion, like lightning, right? It lightens, but then right after it goes away, right? It doth cease before anyone can say lightning, right? But she says, good night. This bud of love. Now we've got the motif of a flower here, right? And it's a bud, so it hasn't ripened yet. She says, by summer's ripening breath may prove a beauteous flower when we next meet. Good night, as sweet repose and rest. So basically, she calls off anything going any further, although Romeo still doesn't feel that he has her complete undivided adoration. But Juliet says, I am more invested than you think I am. Let me know when I should come to you. And if you marry me tomorrow, I will lay all my fortunes at thy foot, follow my Lord throughout the world. So she devotes herself to him, swears by marriage that she will share her fortune, and if anything, follow him if need to be. And that's and they make their plan, and obviously they can't say goodnight. And let's see, we'll notice here at the end, right, we've got some rhyming couplets, and this lets the other actors know, hey, scene 3 is coming. Make sure that you're ready to go. And let's see. Romeo says, I wish I could go to sleep, but I will go to my ghostly father's cell to help to crave my dear hap to tell. And so keep in mind that Romeo hasn't been asleep yet tonight. And if you remember, this was a pattern that he had already been, I guess, showing when we were first introduced to him. So he's up all night, and now he's going to go to the Friar Lawrence's place to get some advice and hopefully get him to marry both he and Juliet. Now, what I love about the beginning of scene 3 of Act 2 is Friar Lawrence's soliloquy. Okay, no one's here with him. And his soliloquy is really important because it really shows the two sides of life, good versus evil. And he does this through nature, right? And he'll talk about flowers in here, okay? And he talks about light versus dark, okay? Makes some allusions to Titan. But what he talks about in plants, herbs, stones, and their true qualities, and this represents life. It says the earth gives special good to these plants, herbs, stones. Okay. But he says if it's strained from that fair use, if you go beyond what nature has planned just naturally, it revolts from true birth, stumbling on abuse. Virtue itself turns to vice, being misapplied. So he talks about how good can change to evil if it's misapplied. Pretty important information here. And vice, sometimes by action, dignified. Now, this is a religious person talking about how evil can be justified. Because within the infant rind of this small flower, right, talking about a representation of life and beauty, poison has residence and medicine power. Okay, so we learn about his commentary on good versus evil. He talks about how in life, what's inside of a person can be poisonous, but it could also be medicinal or positive. So you got a negative and a positive. Okay, two such opposed kings encamp in a man as well as herbs, grace and rude will. And where the worser, right, rude will is predominant, full soon the canker death eats up that plant. So he ends with a commentary on another motif that pops up, death. So in this first soliloquy, we really get to learn who Friar Lawrence is. And then moving on, throughout this, Romeo speaks to Friar Lawrence and he notices that Romeo has not been in bed that night. And he was like, were you with Rosaline? And he says, no, right? I've forgotten that name and that name's woe. And he says, well, where have you been? And he says, well, I must tell you, I was feasting with mine enemy, where on a sudden one hath wounded me that's wounded by me, referencing Cupid's arrow. But basically, they are all, both he and Juliet are definitely going to stay together. He says, basically, you're confusing me. And he says, well, my dear heart's dear love is set on the fair daughter of rich Capulet. Now, notice how he actually uses that description there. And basically, we met, we wooed, and made exchange of vow. And notice how the friar reacts to this, right? I can't believe it. He talks about how young men's love then lies not truly in their hearts, but in their eyes. So it's a comment on, infatuation versus true love. You move too quickly, right? And he basically speaks, and you'll notice in rhyming couplets, and because he does this, his speech is very fast. He says, basically, women fall where there's no strength in men. By doing what you're doing, moving so quickly, Romeo, you may create a fall for these women. Friar Lawrence, Romeo says, please don't yell at me anymore, right? And we're in love together. It's not like I am chasing after someone like Rosaline who wanted nothing to do with me. And Friar Lawrence here makes a decision. And it reflects right on the soliloquy that he was speaking earlier, okay? He says, I'll be thy assistant. And the reason why is because he wants to make sure that this love will turn the household's rancor or anger to pure love. And then we flash quickly to a street and scene 4. I'm just going to go quickly here through scene 4 and scene 5. In scene 4, we get to see the positive part of Romeo here. And we see some banter between him and Mercutio, just like best friends would actually have. You have kind of a rhythm to your speech. Sometimes you kid with each other, mess with each other, and that's exactly what they're doing here on this page. And notice that Mercutio and Benvolio have no idea about Juliet because Romeo says nothing. And in the midst of this banter, the nurse, who we met back in Act 1, or Juliet's nanny, shows up with her servant and looks for Romeo to basically set up a time. And throughout this, Mercutio gives the nurse some, messes with her a little bit too. And you get a lot of his personality from this interaction. And also the nurses, because she can come back with a good one too, verbally also. But do notice, right, she's not speaking in iambic pentameter, and Romeo doesn't speak in iambic pentameter also because he's speaking to someone who's uneducated until we get back down here. Okay, so you'll notice that there's some comfortable speech between them. Romeo pledges his love to Juliet via the nurse. And then in scene 5, we go back to the Capulets' house, and there's another soliloquy here. And we can see the passion and the immaturity of Juliet throughout this soliloquy because she's so nervous that Romeo isn't going to basically go along with the deal that they made earlier to get married, and she's waiting for the nurse to come. You can see her impatience, basically. And finally, the nurse tells Juliet, hie you to church. I must fetch a ladder by the which your love must climb a bird's nest soon when it is dark. So basically, she's setting up Romeo's ascent into her chamber later that night after the marriage, so they can consummate the marriage. And in scene 6, Romeo and Juliet finally get married, and that's the end. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.